Welcome to the Best Business Practices in Healthcare, the podcast where my guests share best practices for the business side of healthcare. Today we have with us CJ Wolf. Thank you for joining us, CJ.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
You bet. Well, let's kick it off by having you just do a quick introduction and a little bit of background about yourself.
Sure. So my name is CJ Wolf, and I have been working in healthcare coding and compliance for about 25 years now, full time. You know, we all kind of come to compliance and coding from different parts of different careers. I came from a clinical world, so I'm actually an MD by schooling, but recognized that I didn't want to do direct patient care, but I still loved healthcare. So I got involved in actually in coding and educating physicians first. So as I mentioned, I've been doing this for about 25 years now. The first about 20 years of my career, mainly in-house. So I've worked for large health systems, academic medical centers, medical device company, predominantly doing compliance, right? So, and depending on where I was, focus on billing or other just general compliance, those sorts of things. And then last, 6 or 7 years, I've been teaching full time at university, undergraduate university in healthcare administration, focusing mostly on healthcare law and ethics and those sorts of things. And then I do a little consulting on the side. So yeah, that's basically what I do for fun. I love to fish and hike and read books and be outside.
Nice. Well, and you live in a good part of the country to do that.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, I am excited about the topic that you brought today because I think it's one of those topics that people want to try to avoid. It's kind of like out of sight, out of mind. So why don't you tell us what topic you brought for us?
Yeah. So what I brought to discuss is coding and billing issue. So again, I was working in compliance, and most of us in compliance do proactive auditing and monitoring.
Mhm.
Well, we uncovered an issue that was going on for a few years, and it was a problem, and it turned out to be, in my opinion, a significant payback of funds. And then you bring that to leadership, and after the shock wears off, they start kind of processing through things a little bit. And so that's it in a nutshell, and we can dive in with more specifics, but that's it kind of at a high level.
Yeah. Well, and that's one of, I think, the problems, right, is not even so much the problems, but we do these audits and we do uncover problems, right? We uncover things that are out there, which is why we do the audits, right? That's the best way to do it. It's better than having, OIG or someone walking in and saying, hey, look, we're going to do an audit. It's better to know that up front.
Exactly.
Yeah. So what was the progression after you uncovered this problem?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So we were just doing a standard audit. It was one of our department, and this was hospital outpatient services and physician coding. So it was both the hospital side of it and the physician side of it, but the coding was wrong on both. And it basically was an unbundling issue where the department and physicians were using a modifier 59 to kind of unbundle. And we all know there are times when that's appropriate, when the 59 is appropriate to use. But in this circumstance, it wasn't. So we were just doing a regular routine audit. We had questions about, we hadn't even finished the audit. We had questions about some of the things we were finding. And so we went back to the department and said, hey, we just want to understand, are we understanding this correctly? Long story short, department says, yeah, we do this on every single one because, this is extra work, or I understand it's extra work, but reimbursement rules say that service, unless it's in a separate session or a separate location, then that work is considered included in the payment. Oh, but the payment is so low that we have to do this. Well, yeah, there's other avenues to argue payment and to say you're not getting paid enough, but to kind of code around the issue is a problem. So that's kind of how it started. And so we hadn't even really finished the audit. We were just asking questions so we understood. And that was kind of our worst fear. It's like, boy, yeah, they have been doing this a long time. So then we kind of finished that standard audit. We made note of the few findings on this one issue. And then we said, okay, if that truly is the case, we're going to have to look at this. And, how long you've been doing this? Well, as long as I can remember, and I've been here 17 years. And, so I was like, oh, okay, so let's define our universe. So now we had a new problem, right? In that other audit, it was just kind of a general audit of kind of their bread and butter services. Now we knew a specific issue, and we had to just hone in on just that one issue. So we had to find our universe of claims, see when it started, when did this regulation start, when were you, when did we know we shouldn't be using modifier 59 in that way. And so then we did a full audit that way, and just on that issue. And what was hard with that is the department knew that we had concerns with that one issue. So we had finished just kind of our routine audit, but they were just like, well, what's this going to mean? What's this going to mean?
Mm-hmm.
If you're disagreeing. So they started kind of getting their ducks in a row, if you will, getting
Mm-hmm.
their leadership ready to chime in when we finished the audit, because they expected exactly what we found, is that this was like a huge error rate. And so then we decided to figure out, okay, how much money is this going to be? Is it truly a payback type
Mm-hmm.
of situation? So that we got to that point, and then the real issues started.
So once you've established there's a problem, right? There's a coding error, and you do, have to then determine, okay, we're reporting this. What is that step like? And again, getting the buy-in from leadership is probably the first hurdle.
And that was the problem. That's why I wanted to bring this issue, because, you know, regardless of how this one issue worked out, I think everyone who's listening, you're going to probably be in a situation somewhat like this. And so just maybe before I get to kind of how this issue rolled out and played out, I would just recommend to everybody, since this is best practices, I would make sure that everyone understands that, look, when we have a compliance program or an auditing and monitoring program, this is what it means, right? We're
Mm-hmm.
supposed to do it. So we're not saying we shouldn't do it, but just so everyone's aware, when you do these reviews and you find issues, we're obligated to pay them back. So
Mm-hmm.
number one, I would make sure that you have kind of the cultural buy-in,
Mm-hmm.
right? That the leadership understands what compliance is about, and that paybacks are a part of doing this work, and have a policy, have a written
Yeah.
policy that says, look, it's our organization's policy that when we find overpayments or when we see
Mm-hmm.
mistakes, and no one was doing this like fraudulently, right? Like
No,
no one
right.
woke up and said, okay, how can I cheat? They just were thinking, look, this is revenue is low and we really do that, and that's extra work, but they didn't think that the work is actually included in payment for something else. So I guess my kind of best practice would be make sure leadership understands what you're doing, because it could uncover, and even if you don't
Mm-hmm.
uncover it on your first few audits, eventually you'll find something, because
Yes.
no organization is perfect. It's not always going to be a big overpayment, maybe, but there's going to be this issue. So knowing up front what that might seem like and look like, who you're going to talk to, who's going to do the final kind of sign off on it. So I would recommend having a policy. And then the other thing I would recommend is having a committee.
Oh, yeah.
The scenario I'm describing, we actually did have a compliance committee. And so this actually went up to the compliance committee, so that all the parties involved, because our job is to kind of identify the issues, raise the issues, and then the debates started. The debates of, well, are you really reading that regulation correctly? Are you really looking at
Mm-hmm.
that code correctly? Are you looking at the modifier correctly? Do we really have to pay this back, or can we just correct it now and do the correct way moving forward? So we had all of those sorts of discussions. We had our legal counsel involved. We had in-house counsel. And so we had all those sorts of discussions. Even, and I don't know if you or if other of your listeners might do this, you can even query, right? And this was a Medicare issue. So you could query the local Medicare administrative contractor in writing and say, here's a hypothetical, or here's a situation.
Mm-hmm.
Do you view this as an overpayment, or those sorts of things? And we actually did that through counsel. So it was done anonymously through counsel. And we needed to do that. From a compliance standpoint, we had already been working through this in our mind, and we were
Right.
pretty confident. But leadership needed time to process it. So that's the other advice, and I don't know what your thoughts are on it, are on that. Letting leaders process. Do you think that that's an important part? Because it was really important in this particular scenario.
Yeah, I think so. And I think you also hit the nail on the head, right? Is everybody needs to understand that an audit is occurring and that what the potentials are, right? And they all need to understand this is important, right? We need to be able to show that we have a compliance program, that we're running it, we're being fair, we're not trying to, hide anything, right?
Right.
Once they all get that, and then when you come back and you say, okay, we found this issue. I mean, you're right. I mean, the the giving them time to process, especially when you uncover something so big, right?
Right.
Like I
Right.
worked with an organization that had a very large, in a couple of their specialties, very large error that came out through an audit, right?
Yeah.
And so we moved from a retrospective to a prospective audit,
Smart.
right, with them as well after we got through the issue and after it had already been reported and we were, following our compliance plan. But even just that took time. And like every little step took time for the leadership to process what that meant, right?
Right.
Even the piece where we said, okay, we're moving from a retrospective to a prospective. And they're like, well, wait, what does that mean? Right. So
Yes.
had to spend some time in that as well. So I think it just takes
Yeah.
people a little bit of time to digest what we're telling them.
Exactly. And so we actually went through that process, and over time, we were able to. One of the individuals on the committee who was not in the compliance department was able to kind of see things the way that we were seeing it, and then they were kind of the broker, if you will,
Mm.
in bringing everyone else along, and then eventually the correct decision was made, and funds were returned, and I think it's really important too to it was important for me personally to realize that it's
Mhm.
not my call. So,
Mm.
I have the knowledge and I have an opinion, and I think, yes,
Mhm.
this is the issue. But ultimately, the organization owns that burden and that risk. And so, the other kind of best practice that I would recommend, because not all of these types of issues will turn out the way that you hope for,
Right.
and business leaders might make a decision to do something else, or it might legitimately be a gray area.
Right.
And you might want to kind of default to do the conservative thing, and they might feel like, well, there's no firm regulation on this. We've gone to legal, we've gone to this, we've gone to that, and people feel like we have an argument here. And so then they might make those business decisions. But I think it's really important to make sure that it's transparent,
Mhm.
so that a year later, if it does turn out badly, they're not saying, well, you told us this was okay. Right. I'd like to be on record, and in the
Mhm.
notes and in the minutes to be saying, look, we discussed this. You received opinions from outside counsel, from, all these other leaders, and a
Mhm.
committee decision was made with eyes wide open to
Mhm.
follow this path. So that, I think, is another best practice, because if we're in compliance and in coding and billing, you're bound to come across arguments that you're not going to win.
Right.
And so I think that's kind of a good way to deal with things.
Well, and I think too, along those lines, is having the like an audit result report, right?
Yes.
And having your log, your book, your binder, whatever it happens to be. I mean, I'm old school, back where we used to just have everything in a binder, and you
Yep.
put your audits in there and what happened and occurred, and just having that documentation. I think me personally and professionally, that helps me feel better about whatever decision is made. We have
That's
it
right.
documented. Again, like you said, it's not my decision. My job is to present you with the findings.
That's right.
Your job is to make the decision about how we move
Yeah.
forward, right? Again, we can make recommendations, but that always makes me feel better is I've got it in a report.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing that I think having this discussion is not such a bad idea is just to say, look, there's about 18 people in our organization who know about this audit. As a committee of 6, you're deciding to do X, Y, or Z, but there's 12 other people who know about it. Just realize that there's incentives for whistleblowers. And so
Mhm.
you may decide not to do something. I'm not saying any of these individuals will blow the whistle, but
Right.
if they feel strongly enough about it, that is something that could happen. Again, you're just kind of letting people know what the worst case scenario would be, and then hopefully they do the right thing. But to be fair to the other side that was kind of arguing against us, there were some ambiguities in what we
Mm.
were reading. I didn't feel like it was ambiguous because I dealt with Modifier 59 for 20 years,
Right.
but they were trying to split hairs and anyway. So I think you
Yeah.
get it. You're dealing with that too.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, I'm fortunate. I'm working with a practice that's only been there 6 months in, right? And
Okay.
we started doing monthly audits, retrospective audits about 2 or 3 months ago. And so every month it's a new targeted area. And, when we gave them the first results, their reaction was, oh my gosh, we're doing terrible. And we're
Right.
like, well, first off, that's why we do these, right? Is education. so
Right.
that you know what it is that we found and how to change it and what the definitions are, right? Because
Exactly.
everybody comes to the table with a little different interpretation. And obviously, I'm one of those that I like to have lots of resources to back up everything that I show, right? Like,
Exactly.
here's all these
Chapter and verse.
resources. Yes, exactly right. But, then I'm like, this is, again, this is why we do it, right? And every month and as soon as we circle back around to this topic again next quarter, guess what? I expect you're going to do better. And
Exactly.
that's what this is about, right? And then we go back, and I was fortunate with them. They had no problem doing corrected claims and getting things out correct. But it is one of those probably challenges in doing compliance audits,
Yes.
is when you do find something, how do you take care of it? And the policy, I think, is very effective with that, because you can always, I'm a policy girl. I can
That's right.
always come back to the policy. What's in the policy? What did we
That's
agree
right.
to in the very beginning?
That's right. And that's why I think it's also a best practice to have a solid code of conduct, because you cannot always predict what the error might be. And
Right.
codes of conduct tend to be at a higher level, more generic terminology that says, we are going to follow the law. We are going to keep patient information confidential. We are going to follow all billing rules. So you can give kind of these broad statements. We are an organization that when we find errors, we do corrective action. That includes, returning funds when that action is warranted. So having that kind of language in your code of conduct can be something you can turn back to, because you're never going to be able to predict every possible scenario that could go wrong. So if you have this guiding document that that explains certain principles, you can turn to that type of document. So that's another good, I think, best practice is have a good solid code of conduct.
Yeah, no, good ad for sure. So this group that you were working with, as you have your compliance group, had that group been formed prior to the audit
It
or
had.
after? Okay.
It had. And so that was because and that I think is also best practice, is
Yeah.
have that group in place, and they were already seen as an authority in the area as well. So fortunately the committee structure was in place. It was on our next agenda. We met, I think, quarterly, and it was on our next agenda. Hey, we're presenting. And actually, before we finished the audit, the focused problem audit, we
Mm-hmm.
had already raised the issue with that
Oh, good.
committee the prior quarter. And we said, hey,
Mm-hmm.
we were doing a standard routine audit. 90% of the things turned out just fine, but we found this one issue. And then we were told that they do this always for these types of services. So we now have to do a deeper dive. So the committee already, and then we kind of gave them, look, worst case scenario, and it's starting to feel like this, it might be a major, repayment type of issues. We were able to kind of plant the seeds a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But it still was a shock when we came back with the results and said, yeah, this is like a 90% error rate.
Right, right. Well, and not everybody has legal counsel to help counsel them through that too, right?
Correct.
So
Correct.
then they have to reach out. Any advice on, what kind of counsel you find to assist you in these areas?
Yeah, absolutely. So like you mentioned, we were fortunate we had in-house counsel, but because there was some pushback in between, we actually engaged outside counsel for an
Oh.
opinion. So even though we had inside counsel, they kind of had their stance to kind of keep all the parties happy. They said, look,
Mm-hmm.
let's just engage somebody who's independent and see what they think. And that really, I think, was the biggest help for us.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot always engage, because that outside counsel agreed with us essentially. And you cannot always engage outside counsel because it's expensive. But
Right.
this issue was big enough that it
Mm-hmm.
warranted that spend of getting that, because it was just too risky
Right.
otherwise.
Right. Right. Yeah, and you have to find somebody who understands healthcare compliance.
Correct.
Um, and they're not always, on every street corner, so you have to dig
They're
a little
not.
bit.
And yep. And, if people are looking for that, I'm sure people, I get approached all the time because I've made, contacts with a bunch of attorneys over the years, and I know which ones deal with certain issues. And,
Mhm.
some do really well with like hospital inpatient issues, while some are really good with physician issues. So, it does help to kind of know those people. So if people are in those hard places, they should feel free to reach out to me, and I might be able to give them some names at
Some
least.
recommendations. That's awesome. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think that's probably one of the scary things is who do we reach out to? Like, I mean, I've worked with a practice before who's like, we don't know who to go to for this. So we've got to do some like
Yep.
networking and talk to people and figure out who do we go to talk about
Yep.
this particular issue because we're going to need counsel. We know we do. And our in-house counsel doesn't deal with this, right? This is not
Exactly.
their wheelhouse. And
That's right.
acknowledging that I think was kudos to them, right? For
Yep.
saying this is not their wheelhouse. That's okay. Let's reach out to somebody else. So
Yeah, exactly.
yeah. Yeah. Well, anything else you'd add on this topic?
No, I don't think so. Just, maybe just this, it gets easier the longer you do it.
Yes.
So that was like one of that was kind of, I was probably not really mid-career, but I wasn't also just a beginner. I was probably 6 or 7 years into compliance, but it was my first really, really big one where it was a huge payback and there was a lot of pushback internally. Of course, I'd been involved in a lot of other paybacks that were small and people were like, okay, that's fine. No big deal. So
Right.
that was a real learning experience for me personally because I made some mistakes. And, like I said, I was kind of declaring this is how it is. And I learned, look, this is not my decision, no matter how passionate I am
Mm-hmm.
about this. So so I learned some things and then I did much better moving forward.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's awesome. Well, again, I really appreciate you joining us today and bringing forth this topic. Again, it's very important out there. Everyone needs to have a compliance plan. Everybody needs to be doing these audits. Even if you think you're small enough, you need to be doing these audits and
Absolutely.
be aware of this information. I had another client I was working with, and recently a new practitioner came on. So they'd been in the practice for 3 to 6 months. We're like, okay, now let's do their audit. And when we reviewed the audit results with them, she was like, I've worked for large organizations, and they have never done this. Right.
Wow.
So, yeah, so that was surprising for me to hear, right? Somebody that came from a large healthcare group
Right.
to a very small practice. And they're like, this is the first time I've ever had this. And they've been
Wow.
practicing for 20 years.
Yeah. Wow. That's amazing.
Yeah.
So
So
interesting.
this is a big gap, I think, in healthcare for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you
So
for having me. It's been a pleasure.
you bet. Well, everyone out there, have a great day, and we will see you on the next podcast.